Hi everyone, and welcome to the next part of Romans, this little training video that will hopefully help you prepare your groups better. We're looking at the next section, of course, Romans 2:17 all the way through to 3 verse 20. It's a big section, there's a lot to get through. I'd urge you not to get bogged down in too much detail. As I said on Sunday, it kind of marks the end of the bad news, if you like. Paul's been on this since 1 verse 18. It's really important that he explains the bad news before he gets to the good news that we'll look at next week. So let's jump straight in. That's the passage we're looking at 2 verse, and you'll notice that, of course, he started addressing the Jews directly in 2 verse 1, and he's still on that same theme, 2 verse 17, and he'll address the two things that were most important distinguishing marks of being a Jew, the law and the circumcision. That's in the first two sections, and then he'll wrap up with final arguments and conclusions. It's really important that he addresses this issue, though, because the church in Rome was divided between Jew and Gentile to a certain extent, and he needed to show that both groups were equally under sin, were equally under the bad news, if you like, and both groups therefore needed to hear the good news of the gospel that he'll get to in 3 verse 21 and following. So let's look at the first part. Here he's dealing with the law and the great privilege it is for Jewish people to have the law. And he starts in just this first block here up to 21, just by acknowledging that it is a great privilege. They have the law, they can teach the law, they can instruct others in the law. That is a real privilege. The word brag here, I know it's a real negative word in English. Paul means it in a more neutral way. He's acknowledging that these guys are teachers of the law. But the accusation comes in 3 verse 21. Here, he actually says the main accusation is, yes, well, you have the law, you can teach the law, but why don't you teach it to yourself? That's the problem with the Jewish people at that time. And then he lists their hypocrisy in that. That's verses 21 onwards. You're teaching all these things, but then you're teaching against all these things, but then you're doing it yourself. And as a result, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles, quoting there from Isaiah. Then he moves on to circumcision. He acknowledges that circumcision only has value if you're really obeying the law. But the Jews, of course, derive great confidence from the sign of circumcision. It's what God had given to mark them out as his people. But Paul's point is that the ceremony is only valuable if it symbolized something that had really changed on the inside. The exterior ceremonies mean nothing if the interior is not changed. And it had always been the case. Deuteronomy 10 verse 16, Moses says, "Circumcise your hearts, therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer." And the Jews had forgotten that, and they'd seen circumcision as just an exterior thing, regardless of what's going on the inside. Now, with these two sections, the section on the law and on circumcision, it's just, of course, the main application is to Jewish people, but it's worth just thinking through those of us who are Christians and perhaps have grown up in a very Christian context. Will we ever be guilty of just being experts in the Bible without actually living out the Bible? And will we perhaps become reliant on the external signs of Christianity, baptism, Lord's Supper, etc., etc., and caring more about those things than internal change of the heart that only the Spirit can bring? Then when you get to 3 verse 1, you can see he's starting to wrap things up, but he anticipates an objection that, of course, he's just said some strong things about the law and the circumcision, and, if you like, the sort of limitations of the law and the circumcision. And so it begs the question, what advantage is there in being a Jew? Paul acknowledges, verse 2, that there's plenty of advantage. The Jewish people, unlike any other people group, have been entrusted with the very words of God, and that is a privilege. They've had access to God's words in a way that other people haven't. Then he anticipates further objections. These are a little bit more complicated. You've got to make sure you don't get too bogged down in these. I don't think they're the main part of Paul's argument at the moment. And I think these verses 3 to 8 fall into two main blocks. The first objection I think he's anticipating Jewish people who say, well, God promised to be faithful to us. If we're unfaithful, won't that nullify God's faithfulness? Doesn't God need to keep on being faithful to us even if we're being unfaithful? Well, Paul points out that yes, God promised to be faithful, but he never promised that he would ignore unfaithfulness. He quotes from David. This is from the Psalms, and we think this is what David wrote after the incident with Bathsheba. And David knew full well that God's covenant, yes, it promised blessings for faithfulness, but it also warned of curses for those who are unfaithful. So God must remain true to himself and judge those who are unfaithful. The second part of this objection is really, in some ways, it seems to us quite a bizarre argument. But Paul anticipates somebody saying, well, look, if somebody is unrighteous, and then that leads to God righteously judging them and showing how righteous he is, isn't that really a good thing that results from our evil, and therefore why are we being judged for our evil? You know, God is through us, through him judging our sin, he's able to show how good he is. So is our sin such a bad thing? If my falsehood enhances God's truthfulness and so increases his glory, why am I condemned? Well, Paul, I'm sure we can all see what a perverse argument this is. Paul dismisses it and says, look, if you're thinking that way, you prove all the more that your condemnation is deserved. Let's move on. This is conclusion mode now, 3 verse 9, and this is really where Paul has been headed all the way all the way back at 1 verse 18. And he concludes here that for both Jew and Gentile, well, both groups are under sin. Both groups. That's his conclusion, and I think he's just got one more main point to kind of drive that home, and that's in this long list of Old Testament quotes. Most of these are from the Psalms. There are a few from Isaiah as well. You could look into a bit of detail, and that would be helpful in your groups. I didn't have time to do that in the sermon. But the main point, as we see in 3 verse 19, Paul is actually saying that, look, you guys, you Jews, you're under the law, you love the law, you teach the law. Do you know what your own law says about you? These verses here are actually describing what you're like. So your own law describes you in that way. And so therefore the only valid response is to be silence and to acknowledge that you're accountable to God. And if you are really reading the law properly and humbly, then you'll know that what the law does is that it makes you more aware of your sin, makes you more conscious of sin. It's the law itself cannot make you righteous. Your inability to keep the law just shows you that you cannot be declared righteous through the law. That's about it. Just a few quick pointers on application. Of course, remember, this is the bad news. We're getting to the good news next week. But it is important that we drive this home and that people really appreciate just the situation they're in, that the only right response is to be silent before God and acknowledge that we deserve his judgment and await the good news of Romans 3 verse 21 and following. Outside of Christ, Jews and Gentiles are in just as much trouble. Jews need to be evangelized just like Gentiles do. That was Paul's message, and that's our message to the world as well. Hope that's helpful, and hope your studies go really well.